Right, it's recording.
Okay, so this is Leo Weininger with Uplift, and we are excited to have Dr. Ugo Perego here with us today from Italy. He is a world-renowned, I'll say, geneticist, and we are just so happy to have him join Uplift and to share a helpful message here about the Book of Mormon and some of the common questions that people have regarding DNA. And I think it's a helpful, I guess, supplement for me personally to have this information about this evidence and information about the evidence regarding the Book of Mormon. And so just really grateful that you're able to help us, Dr. Perego. Thank you for your time, and I'll turn it over to you.
But thank you, Leo. So I don't know if I'm world-renowned. Last summer, I walked into a church building in Utah while we were visiting there with my family, and somebody walked up to my wife. I wasn't there when the conversation took place. She told me that afterwards. And this brother asked my wife if I was some famous LDS geneticist, and her reply was quite straightforward. And she looked at him and say, "Well, I don't know if he's famous, but if you do a Google search about him, you'll see that he's quite infamous among some people." And so there are a lot of people that are very adamant about the genetic issue with regard to the Book of Mormon. What I will do today, I'm going to basically show a couple school of thought with regard of DNA and Book of Mormon, and where I stand. And it seems to me, as of today, that is also where the church feels comfortable to stand as well. And of course, there are groups both promoting the DNA in favor to the Book of Mormon as evidence to the Book of Mormon, as well as others that use DNA as the last nail in the coffin to dismiss Book of Mormon historicity and prove it to be a 19th century fictional creation by Joseph Smith. And so when I actually presented my approach, which is, again, what the church feel comfortable to be at today with this position, neither group is very happy with me. And so, of course, then they tend to show that with some website now and some forums. Now, DNA is a complex issue. It's a wonderful instrument. It's a recent instrument with regard of the sciences in general, the different scientific fields. Although it's been discovered in the 50s, we're still doing a lot of work with regard to understanding what can and what cannot be done. We know that it's very accurate when we do a comparison between individuals with their genetics. So it's very good with the forensics, with medical medicine, with genealogy, paternity cases. But then when we go and try to reconstruct the history of humanity and what happened thousands of years ago, we need to understand its limitations. So we do get wonderful information that provides some insights about our recent and ancient past, but then we're still limited to what is that we can figure out. It's kind of like, it's another approach to history. Even when we try to reconstruct history based on archaeology, linguistics, written text, there are still gaps, and those gaps usually we fill them with our best approximation, and that has to be taken into consideration also when you do genetic studies. So I'd like to start with some consideration. I like to read these statements. First of all, this statement came from an article that was published a couple months ago. So the first statement is genetic drift may have erased their traces from the population. We're talking about specific population. Genetic drift may have erased their traces from the population. They may not have left numerous or any descendants in the population. They may simply not have been sampled yet. You know, and as we read this statement, it sounds like we're talking about Nephites or Lamanites descendants. One second, somebody join us and let me do better. Okay, and so it sounds like we're talking about Nephites or Lamanites, but the reality is that we are not talking about them. We're talking about ancient Romans living in certain parts of Europe, specifically in the Great Britain. And these comments were made by a professor, Dr. Jennifer Raff, which is a population geneticist who also has written a lot with regard of Native American DNA. But she was writing for The Guardian, a column, and she was talking about the DNA of ancient Romans. So the point is, when we are trying to reconstruct the history of a population that lived in an area that they colonized, was not their original areas, but is an area that they migrated to and then settled, DNA can't provide always whatever information we think we should find. And just because history or a book says that they have been there doesn't mean that their DNA is found there today, which is basically the story of the Book of Mormon. So if we accept this for other populations, we should accept the same for Book of Mormon. Now, a little bit of science, not too much, but just to let you understand that this is why a lot of people tend to simplify. If a science write a paper and say something like, it looks like that there is no evidence, or we assume that this study, you know, is providing this type of information, then the media would take the science paper and write an article for the layman, for the general population, and say there is absolute evidence that this population never lived. You know, so there is always some sort of a transition by what science says and how science works, and then how science is represented in the media, in the newspapers, in National Geographic, or on TV, and we lose the complexities because people are not prepared. They get confused. They do not have all the background. They have not studied or performed research with regard to DNA. So you need to kind of water it down and bring it to them really simple. And that is why when we talk about DNA, people say, oh, there is absolute evidence that DNA proved the Book of Mormon to be true, or there is absolute evidence that the Book of Mormon is not true. Then you notice people are either not honest in what they're saying, or they don't understand what they're talking about, because a scientist will not make such a claims ever. Okay, we have a first part of the DNA that has been used to study population is called mitochondrial DNA. It's found in a small organelle within the cell, outside the nucleus, but still within the cell membrane. And there are hundreds of mitochondrion, which is the powerhouse for the cell, where the ATP is produced through an aerobic process, which allows for our energy to be available for our body to be able to function. And inside this mitochondrion, we have many copies of a small genome called mitochondrial DNA. We also have our main and principal genome, which is found in the nucleus of the cell, which comprise our 23 pairs of chromosomes. 22 are referred to as autosomes, from 1 to 22, and the 23rd pair are our sex chromosomes that determine the gender of the offspring. So mitochondrial DNA, sex chromosome, particularly the Y chromosome, the male Y chromosome, and the autosomes have been extremely helpful in tracing information about individuals and populations, migrations, ancestry, relationships. Again, we're not going to talk too much about how they work, but here is they are transposed this genetic system on a classic pedigree chart. And as you see, you can have a male or a female. That's the two products that we can have from when a man and a woman conceive a child. And in the paternal line, we have the Y chromosome that determines the male gender, but also provide information about the origin of paternal lines. So Y chromosomes be used to study populations from a paternal perspective. We also have mitochondrial DNA, which is used to trace the history from a female perspective, because mitochondrial DNA is only inherited along the female line. Males and females inherit mitochondrial DNA from their mothers, but only women will transmit their mitochondrial DNA genome to their posterity. Male white mitochondrial DNA is found, is wrapped around the neck of the sperm, which does not participate in the conception and in the creation of a new individual, so it's lost at conception. The rest, and the majority of our DNA, is autosomal DNA from the 22 pairs of autosomes found in the nucleus, and that is inherited from all of our ancestors at a rate of about 50%. So I would have 50% of autosome from my mom and from my dad, but I would have about an average of 25% from each of my grandparents, and then going on and going up, that percentage becomes smaller and smaller. So autosomal DNA is actually very helpful in tracing ancestry back only 5 to 6 generations, and then it becomes too diluted to know exactly which ancestor could have provided us that type of DNA. Now, although I have hundreds, even thousands of ancestors that's going back in time, only a small number of those ancestors will have contributed the DNA I have. So I have many genealogical ancestors, and I need all of them to be here on the earth, but not all of them would have been successful randomly, but not all of them would have been successful in transmitting their DNA. Now, I'm going to use mitochondrial DNA as a case study, although I could do the same type of explanation for each of the genetic system. We just don't have the time to cover all of them. But anytime somebody comes to me and says, oh, look, autosomal DNA shows this about Book of Mormon people, about Native American, or Y chromosome, they did a new study on Y chromosome or Native American. The reality is all the genetic system pretty much follow and are subjective to the same rules for population genetics. So what applies to one applies also to the others. Mitochondrial DNA has, through the years, scientists have been able to create what is called a phylogenetic tree, which is some sort of genealogy tree, as you can see. And they have named each branch or each type of mitochondrial DNA that they found in different population using the letters of the alphabet. And then by looking at the mutation of the different branches of DNA found in the different populations, they have been able to determine two things. Number one, the relationship between every individual on the earth can be assigned to a specific branch, and therefore we can determine how everybody is related along the maternal line. And second, based on the number of mutations you can, and the variation in a specific population, you can also determine how ancient that particular line is. And so the oldest lines, the one that have been around the longest on the earth, are the one found in Africa. And then as we move up to the right part of this tree, we have the younger and newer branches which are found in Europe and in the Americas. Based on this tree, scientists have also been able to determine migration routes, including how the Americas have been populated. So this is a schematic picture, a representation of the Bering Strait, and through the thousands of years that have passed, starting with the last ice age, which took place about 30,000 years ago, all the way into the present time. And this is an important key factor because basically the Americas, they were not like they were today. And based on paleoecological evidence and archaeological evidence, it is pretty evident that when during the last ice age, when both the north part of the globe and the south part of the globe had greater glaciers than we have today. In fact, most of all of Canada and most of North America were covered with ice. Most of Europe, Great Britain, all the way down to South Germany was permanently covered with ice during that time. And because so much of the seawater was trapped into these ice caps in the northern part and the southern part of the hemisphere, the sea coasts were exposed a lot more than they are today. Today we're experiencing the opposite, where because of an increased melting of the ice glaciers, then we're experiencing increased level of the sea level, and so there is some parts of the world where the land is quite shallow that is actually being covered now by seawater. But back 30,000 years ago, we had a lot more ice and a lot more land was exposed. And where there is the Bering Strait today, there was actually a natural continental size landmass that connected as a bridge both east Siberia with what is today the Aleutian Islands and Alaska. And that would have allowed the ancestors of Native America to cross and move along and settle in that piece of land, which was not covered by ice because of the strong winds that are still present today in that part of the world. And because of the strong winds, snow did not settle and glaciers did not build. And so you have some sort of environment that would have been similar to like tundra or steppe, and would have allowed survival of small populations, which then eventually, as the temperature increased, they were able to move eastward into the pristine American double continent and settle there and follow large mammals like mammoths, like the saber-tooth or the giant sloth, and feast and feed on them. And then eventually, as the water level rose again, and there was again a division between Asia and America, which did not allow for these early inhabitants to go back to Asia, and there was separation by the populations. So that is the National Geographic version of how people got to America, and based on archaeological evidence and also based on other disciplines, including DNA, it is estimated that these early Indians, we call them Paleo-Indians, the ancestral Native Americans arrived between 15 to 18,000 years ago, settled and colonized the whole American continent. This is where the whole thing took place within the circle, and that is those arrows is based on migration evidence and relationship of DNA between populations, and so we can, based on the paleoecological evidence that we studied for the melting of the ice, and based on the genetic evidence, we as scientists think that the people in America took place mostly around the Bering Strait, and that was the time that we're talking about. So why am I explaining all of that? This is one second. I'm gonna mute some people here that are, the background noise. Should be better now. Okay, so now, is this the absolute truth? Is that the only migration to the America? No, we don't know that. In fact, if I have time, I'll show you that there are other findings more recently that are showing the possible other ways or additional ways that happened through history for early people to come to the Americas. But this is the most plausible and currently accepted scientific position. What does that mean? means that people have been in the America for 15, 18,000 years, and they multiply and grow as different population. And then the time of the Book of Mormon migrants is a lot more recent, and that they would have come to an already populated continent. And one thing we have to accept today is that there were people, many people in the Americas at the time that the Book of Mormon history took place. Now, some people argue, well, if there were other people here, why does the Book of Mormon not talk about them? That is a valid argument, but I will also address that in a minute. So here is again from another research from 2014 in Nature, the different migrations based on genetic data, both autosomal data, Y chromosome data, mitochondrial data, and archaeological data are in agreement about this migration. There are archaeological sites on both sides of these two land masses that show the presence of individuals, early humans, as early as 32,000 years ago in northeast Siberia, and as early as 17,000 years ago in the Americas, which is about the time when the ice began to melt and corridors became to be available and open for the survival in Beringia, or this landmass to be able to move to the Americas. Okay, so that is the background about what scientists agree on the people in America. Now, how does that fit in the Book of Mormon? Now, there's two schools of thought, as I say. One is the DNA. There is DNA evidence, or at least lack of DNA evidence, to support the Book of Mormon to be historical. And so if there is no DNA from Middle Eastern people in the Americas, therefore the Book of Mormon is a fictitious book. Joseph Smith invented that. The church is not true. And critics of the church and of the Book of Mormon love and embrace this full-heartedly, without even asking themselves any question with regard of the complexity of DNA. Some people have made these statements, and they have very much welcomed that evidence or lack of it. There is a small group, a relatively small groups of Latter-day Saints that is actually pushing genetic evidence as part of an evidence to support the Book of Mormon to be historical. They're based on a mitochondrial DNA marker found in the Great Lakes area of North America called Haplogroup X. And they are making the claim that Haplogroup X is a strong connection to the Middle East, and that is a proof not only that people from the Middle East came to America, but also that the geography of the Book of Mormon took place in the Great Lakes. And that is where we should think the Nephites, the Jaredites, the Lamanites lived. And I personally don't support or don't think the DNA is a valid support to these two school of thought. And I summarize my position, which I call them the 7 heresies about DNA and Book of Mormon. And I'll go ahead and explain what they are. I'm going to list them now and summarize them here, and then I'm going to quickly go through each one of them. First of all, the first heresy. So these are all false statements, of course. Okay, so these are the 7 heresies that I keep hearing all the time. So first, the absence of Israelite DNA is evidence that the Book of Mormon is not historical. The Book of Mormon tells us the history of all Native Americans. When Lehi and his family arrived to the Americas, no one else was there. If scientists can obtain DNA from 70,000 years old Neanderthals, surely they could find Israelite DNA in the Americas from 26 years ago. And if they cannot find it, that means that the Book of Mormon is not true. DNA cannot disappear. It should be there. It should be able to find it no matter how long you wait to look for it. We know exactly what Israelite DNA looks like. Or that's just the 7 heresies in favor of the Book of Mormon. There is indeed DNA in the Americas supporting Israelite migration 2,600 years ago. And that demonstrates in North America. So I'm going to go through each one of them and show you why these are not correct. Body can be. I can now mute Sandy, so if Sandy, you can mute yourself, that would be great. I don't, for some reason I can't. Here it is, thank you. All right, so the absence of Israeli DNA is evidence that the Book of Mormon is not historical. False. Why? First of all, the question we need to ask is there really no Old World DNA in the Americas? Now, we are able to identify very clearly what Native American DNA is, but is there any Old World DNA there? When I say Old World, I mean European, African, or Middle Eastern. The answer is yes, you do find DNA from the Old World in Americas, but scientists, by default, always attribute his Old World DNA to a post-Columbian migration, So everything that is old in the Americas, even if you go in a native tribe, in an isolated native tribe today, and you sample their DNA, you will always find a certain number of individuals with European markers. And the scientists will immediately dismiss those by saying that those markers are evidence that there was a contact after 1492, so after Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. Can we demonstrate that? We can't in many cases because the rate of mutation of DNA is such that you can't say, well, this is the DNA from 1493 or 1495 versus this is the DNA from 1400, meaning before and after the European colonization. For mitochondrial DNA, for example, the rate of mutation is about 5,000 years, which means that anything in between that time frame, you can clearly distinguish. So can you tell if some Old World DNA in the Americas arrived 2,600 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or 50 years ago? And the answer is you cannot do that. It was very, very complex, probably impossible things to do. In fact, I'm gonna skip through the, well, here just to give you an example. This is a science paper about Y chromosome. We talk about mitochondrial DNA, autosomal DNA. This is about Y chromosome. And in this research paper, the scientists wrote this sentence, which I underline. It says, analysis indicated the three major haplogroups. So this is Y chromosome DNA taken from Native American tribes. They didn't go to New York City. They went to where there is a lot of mixing population. They went among Native American tribes, modern Native American tribes, and they collected DNA samples from 588 Native Americans, and 96% of people that they sampled belonged to Y chromosome C, Q, and R. And C and Q are typical Native American Y chromosome branches. R is a typical European branch. That is part of the 96%. But here's what the scientists say. Haplogroup C and Q were deemed to represent early Native American founding Y chromosome lineages, okay? That was obvious and is easy to assess. However, most haplogroup R lineages present in Native Americans most likely came from recent admixture with European. Most likely means we are not sure, but this is the best things we can say about it. So why cannot be sure that that is after European? Because you cannot tell Y chromosome that arrived before the Europeans. Now we're gonna see something more about that later when I'm gonna talk about the Vikings. So second point, second heresy, second false statement. The Book of Mormon tells us the history of all Native American. This is not true. The Book of Mormon is a historical book, but it's not a book of history. If you want to study the history of Native American, you do not use the Book of Mormon because it's a very partial and limited account. The Book of Mormon is more of a family record. It does not have a continental history. The people that kept the records were mostly father to son, lived in the same area, collected information within a very small geographic and limited region. And not only that, but although we have the small plates of Nephi in our book of Mormon, Nephi says absolutely nothing about their time in the Americas. All first Nephi is about their migration from Jerusalem to the building of the ship. And then you go to second Nephi, and you have from second Nephi chapter 1 to second Nephi chapter 4, you have Lehi giving blessings to his posterity. And then in second Nephi chapter 5 is the only chapter that Nephi writes about their time in the Americas. This is when there is a division between Laman and Laman and his family, and Nephi, and whoever wants to follow him, and Nephi moved to the land of Nephi. And that is it. Jacob doesn't say anything about the demographic, the geography. Enos doesn't say anything. But Jacob does say one thing. We're going to see that in a little bit, but that's very limited. We need to catch that. Enos doesn't say much. Jerome, Omni, and all the other smaller authors say absolutely nothing. And then all at once, we are at the time of King Benjamin, and he's an old man giving his final speech, and it's 150 BC. By losing the 116 pages, Martin Harris have robbed us from knowing 450 years of demographics that took place between the arrival of Lehi's family and everything else after that. That would have included also eventual marrying or intermixing with local population. We take the lesson with King Benjamin, where we already have different populations and different things that happened at that point. So what happened during that time? We don't know. When Lehi and his family arrived to the America, no one else was here. That is also false. I told you there are some small evidence in the Book of Mormon. I'm going to tell you very quick. Second Nephi chapter 5, we just talked about it, the only chapter Nephi writes about the time in America. Verses 5 and 6, Nephi lists everybody that follows him to the land of Nephi. He lists him and his wife and children. He lists his brother Sam. He lists his brother Jacob and Joseph, Zoram and his family. And then after he lists all these people, he says, and everybody else that wanted to follow me. And so it's interesting that after listing everybody in his family, there are even other people, more people that want to follow him. And the question is, who are these people? Could those be natives that have embraced the message of Nephi? Jacob chapter 2, which is Jacob is the brother of Nephi, talks about a problem among the Nephites, which is they want and desire and took many wives and concubines. And you wonder, in such a little amount of time, who these wives and concubines could be. And there is some evidence from the Old Testament that concubines could be referred to as wife, not from your own same ethnic group, just like Abraham. He was married to Sarah, but then Sarah's servant was Egyptian, and so she was a concubine to him and not second wife. Another point is Jacob chapter 7, the encounter with Sherem, the Antichrist. In verse 4, it described Sherem as being familiar and knowing the language of the people. Now, Sherem is part of Jacob's group of the migrants, one of the children or grandchildren of Lehi. Why would it be a need to point out that he knew the same language? That would have been a pretty obvious conclusion, but the fact that that is stated seems like maybe he learned that language and he could communicate with the people of Jacob. In verse 6, it states that it took him a long time to meet Jacob. So if you have a small population of 100, 200 people, how long does it take you to meet with Jacob? So it seems to me that maybe Sherem was an outsider, and maybe a possible interpretation it was a local. Now, many church leaders, and not many, but there have been some church leaders and other people, even scholars, that have said that there were no one here on the continent, but there have been many more that have said that there were others, that there were other people in the American continent. It's not an official church position, but from the science, it is evident that there were other people. I'm writing an article about this, and basically we state, thanks to science, we cannot deny the existence of perhaps millions of people in the Western Hemisphere prior to the potential arrival of Book of Mormon migrants. And this must be taken into consideration as we read and interpret any facts record, regardless of what anyone has said in the past regarding to the contribution of Lehi's party to the people of the America. There were other people, and Lehi was a small group that arrived in already populated country. And that is it. I mean, this is what science shows, and this is what we need to talk about it. For the false statement, if scientists can obtain DNA from 70,000 years old Neanderthals, sure they can find the Israeli DNA in the Americas. This is a good thinking, but is a false thinking. There's a fallacy here. First of all, DNA from Neanderthal has been extracted from bones that we knew belonged to Neanderthal. So how do we know that Neanderthal existed? Because full skeletons were discovered, and an anatomical analysis have shown that the skeleton of Neanderthals are different from those of Homo sapiens, and so they were called Neanderthals based on the place where they were found. Now, once we knew that that was a different species than us, in more recent years, they've been able to actually extract the DNA from their bones and provide sequences of the Neanderthal DNA. So first, there was an identification of the skeletons. Then they generated a genetic sequence. So now you can go in a cave and find a very small, tiny piece of bones and not even know if that is a Homo sapiens or Neanderthals, but you can extract the DNA now from the little tiny bones. And since you already have a reference, you know, because you already have the DNA from actual skeletons, complete skeleton Neanderthals, you can tell if the small bones also is Neanderthal or belongs to another species. We do not have a reference for Lehi's family. We don't have a tomb that says Lehi is buried here, Laman is buried here, you know, and therefore we can't for sure go and get their DNA, and we don't know what their DNA looks like to be able to then identify that among the other European DNA that you find in the Americas. There is another point of interest which has to do with Vikings. We know through a record that was kept by Icelandic woman that Vikings they settled in Greenland for over 400 years, between 1000 to 1400 AD. They were there less than 100 years before Columbus' arrival to the Americas. They built villages, and there is absolute evidence that they were moving back and forth between the Americas and the Scandinavian peninsula in Iceland. However, although we do have DNA that looks like came from the America in Iceland, we cannot find Viking DNA in the Americas. And the reason we cannot find it is that we are unable to identify it. It's probably there, but we don't know if it came at the Vikings' time or these are Europeans that came after Christopher Columbus discovered America. So if we cannot find Viking DNA today, why should we find you know, Israelite DNA from one family, basically one family DNA in the Americas after 2,600 years? And sure that the Vikings provided a lot more diversity, more people, and there were not just one family that arrived. Another point, another heresy, another false point is DNA can just disappear. There were many things that happened to the Americas. The Book of Mormon talk about great distractions at the time of the coming of the Savior. It talks about great warfare and the extermination of entire people. We know when the Europeans arrived, they brought disease and slavery and warfare. And so it is actually estimated that the survival rate after the European conquest in the America was 1 out of 25 people. So every 25 people once survived, 24 died. And that was not random. That means that to the left of this picture, you see a lot more colors, and means there was a lot more genetic information prior to any catastrophic event, including the arrival of the European. After those many people died, the survivor only carried a number of the DNA that was present before. And based on the survival is the DNA that we have today. Some people say, well, what about ancient DNA? Can you reconstruct the history instead of collecting modern DNA from ancient DNA? But we have great difficulties with that too. First of all, were made of a material that decomposed. It is estimated that 1 out of 10,000 people will die in a place where bones will be survive deterioration and allow for DNA extraction. And so it's very hard to reconstruct the entire population based on very few ancient DNA samples. And when that is done, they've done a case in South America where they discovered about over 90 mummies that were preserved in permafrost up in the Andes, and they did the DNA on these people. And although that was Native American DNA, none of that DNA was found in the modern population, thus proving that there's been what is called genetic drift, or a reduction of diversity of DNA between the past and today. That shows that DNA cannot be used to reconstruct the DNA of the past all the time. 6 heresies, we know what Israelite DNA looks like. This is also not true because there is not such a thing as Israelite DNA. First of all, the people that live in Israel today are not the same people that lived there 2,600 years ago. After 1948, people have been start returning to Israel after more than 1,900 years that they were away. And these are people that lived in New York, in Russia, in Europe, and this is the DNA they're bringing. Israelites accept conversion. You can marry a non-Jew individual if the person, if the children will be raised in Judaism. Entire countries were converted to Judaism. So being an Israelite does not mean that you have to be biologically an Israelite. It's kind of like Mormons. There is no Mormon DNA, you know, that could be converts. Another point is that there is not exclusively DNA from one country that looks like that is only found in that country. This is a mitochondrial variation in certain countries in the old world that includes Europe, the Arabian Peninsula, and Africa. So you can see every single place has more than one type of DNA. They're all color-coded. And what changes from place to place is the frequency, or how, what is the percentage of the population that carries a particular marker compared to another one. So if we look at Palestinians, for example, so that would be the people living in Israel today, and I'm just going to use the colors because it's easy, not the names of these markers. You have the greatest majority being a red or a dark green. Now, if you look at Western Europeans, you have a lot more red and and fewer green of the same type, unless you have both of them present in both places. What does it mean? So we don't know if Lehi's family belonged to a more frequent or less frequent type of DNA from their country. They could have had a very rare DNA or very common DNA. We don't know what the DNA they had, and we don't know what DNA we're looking in the Americas. We can have it right under our nose and not being able to discern it. I'm going to conclude with 3 updates that were done this year on the Book of Mormon and DNA studies essay found on LDS.org under Gospel Topics. I helped writing this essay with the help of other scientists, and the church, after reviews, and they approve it and posted that. It can change in the future. One thing that told them is that we need to agree that when we wrote and published that for the first time, which was in 2013, at the end of 2013 it was published, that because it's a scientific topic, the science change over time, and so we need to be able to change that and update it. So we did an update this year on this topic, and the 3 updates have to do mostly with the references. So don't read only the article, Book of DNA Study, but also look at the references. Reference number 2 has a full text of this article, the one that I originally wrote for the church. So it was a 40 pages article that then was shrunk down to the essay. So if some people say, well, but the essay does not cover all the details, and it's true because they wanted to keep the article short and easy to read. But if you want all the details or most of the details, I would suggest that you go to the the footnote here and read the full article. Okay, so second change, that's the article right here on Mormon Interpreter. Second thing is the change in reference number 6 that has to do with how the church does not have an official position with regard to where the geography of the Book of Mormon took place. That's also found in the seminary manual. That's because I'm leading to the 7th heresy, which is the Book of Mormon. DNA can prove the Book of Mormon to be true. There was an article in the Deseret News this summer that talk about how the church is making a new movie about the Book of Mormon, and they purposely decide to keep the geography as natural as possible, as not to give anybody the idea that the church is favoring one's geographic location in the Americas over another. So if the church does not care where the Book of Mormon took place, neither should we. At least we can have preferences. We can have, as a hobby, our favorite possible site, either Mesoamerica, California Bay, or Baja California, I mean, or the Great Lakes. But the important thing is that we don't impose that hobby of ours, the passion of ours, onto others, as if that is an important component of the gospel. The church does not. They could make a statement that they are not making it, so we should not do the same. Third changes that was made this year in the Book of Mormon DNA Studies Gospel topic is a reference from Dr. Jennifer Ruff, which is the one that we mentioned before with regard of the Guardian and the Roman studies. And she wrote an article with regard to Haplogroup X, which has been used by some as a proof for Book of Mormon geography in North America. And we are going to talk about this right now. This is a man named Rod Meldrum. He's been a strong advocate about North American geography. He might have some good points about it, but one of the things that he pushes a lot is that the DNA is actually proving the Book of Mormon to be true and that it took place in North America. But this is a YouTube video that went viral, and the title of this YouTube video was DNA versus Book of Mormon, Incredible New Evidence. And in this video, he talks about how Haplogroup X is a proof that the Book of Mormon is true. And I'm going to finish this this presentation talking about how this is not possible and is not true. So let's look at this tree, and that is where Haplogroup X is found. This tree is one of the newer branches. Now, Haplogroup X has many sub-branches. This is a map of all the known, it's part of the tree of all known branches of Haplogroup X. You can see Haplogroup X is right here on the top, and then there are many sub-branches called X1, X2, X3, X4, and so on. And then everyone has their own sub-branches. The one that is found in the Great Lakes area is the one called X2A. That's it. So when we say Haplogroup X, we're only talking about the top line, the general line. But when we look at the specifics, we found all the branches in Europe and some in Asia, but we don't find X2A in Europe and in Asia. And then when we look at the Americas, we find only X2A, and we don't find the other ones. So there is some differences between what we find in the Americas versus what we find in Europe. So when we look at general X, we say, where do we find X? Without focusing on the sub-branches, you can see that you find it both in North America and in the world. And but when you look at only X2A, we assume that it came about the same time as the other lineages in the America to the Bering Strait. Why we do that? Because recently there was a DNA done on a skeleton that was discovered in 1986 for a skeleton that was named the Kennewick Man. He was discovered in an area called Kennewick on the Columbia River. And that part is found, as you can see, in Northwest America. And that Northwest America is very close to the passage from the Bering Strait where all the other Native American Paleo-Indian DNA came from. The skeleton was carbon dated 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, which also predate Book of Mormon people. But this is where it gets more interesting, is that all these squares that you see, these blue squares right here, they represent North American lineages, all sub-branches of this X2A. We have not found any X, any X2, or any X2A. We only found people that belong to sub-branches of X2A. There's one exception right here. Don't worry about that. That's I actually found. This comes from a paper that I published in 2009. And this is the only sample X2G that has not been found anywhere else. There's only one case identified, so it doesn't tell us much about what this is and what is not. But everyone else we found in the Great Lakes area is a much younger, time-wise sample than this Kennewick man. The Kennewick man has a pure X2A, no additional mutations, X2A lineage. So, which means that he belonged to a group that was ancestral or older genetically than all the modern DNA belonging to the same group. And because it's the oldest and is found in, so let me summarize it here, it's kind of easy. So X2A is not found in the Middle East, it's only found in the Great Lakes. None of the X2A lineages present in the Middle East is ancestral to X2A, meaning they're not older and than the one in Americas, and the one in Americas did not come, is not daughter, is not younger than the one in the Middle East. The mutation rate predate the Book of Mormon time for X2A, so it's an older lineage. But when we discovered the DNA of the Kennewick man, we saw that it belongs to the oldest X2As found in Americas. He's 8,000 to 9,000 years old based on carbon dating. It's found geographically closer to the Bering Strait passage. And when we look at his autosomal DNA, he is Native American, is not European. So the mitochondrial DNA is Native American, the autosomal DNA is Native American. Where does X2A come from? Scientists don't know. And here is a conclusion from this paper, which is important, and is the one referenced in the gospel topic. Is the new change that was done. It is of course possible the genetic evidence of an ancient transatlantic migration event simply has not been found yet. Should credible evidence of direct gene flow from an ancient Eritrean or Middle Eastern population be found within ancient Native American genomes, we will require the field to reassess the Beringian-only model of prehistoric Native American migration. What it means is, if we're going to find something else, we are going to say, well, maybe people came in other ways, you know. But right now, this is the best we have with the evidence we have at this point. However, no such evidence has been found, and the Beringian migration model remains the best interpretation of the genetic, archaeological, paleoclimatic data to date. What does it mean? Is that DNA in the Great Lakes area is not proof that the Book of Mormon is true. And those to say that are either not understanding the issue or purposely lying about it. Just want to show you these two slides. These are really the last two slides. And then if you have any question, I'll be happy to answer them. This is from Nature from January 2017. It's a reassessment based on recent data of all the people in the world. And you can see there are additional routes that are being considered now with regard to the colonization of Central and South America. And there is DNA that have been found in some of the Polynesian islands, including particularly the Easter Island, where it shows a connection between Polynesian groups and Native American groups. We don't know the flow of migration, if it came from Asia to America or if it was from America to Asia. But what is showing to us that probably there were additional way, maybe some highland hopping, like is described in the Book of Ether, that would have provided some non-Beringian migration in the southern part. So some of these region-only migration are actually being re-evaluated. This was published in August of this year, so you can see it's a very recent paper, and they're finding a lot of evidence on the coastlines that show that early Native Americans perhaps also arrived by boat, so not only by foot, maybe built in some rudimentary raft that allowed them to come. So anyway, all this is pretty much not showing that the Book of Mormon is true, but definitely make the story of building a boat, coming to the Americas, settling here, as described in the Book of Mormon, a lot more plausible. And so what are the take-home lessons? Genetic data fails to produce evidence that weighs incredibly conclusively in favor of or against the historicity of the Book of Mormon. Simply say, you cannot use DNA to prove or disprove the Book of Mormon. And scientists from different disciplines are still actively working to understand the timing, number of migratory events, routes, etc., that characterize the people of the Americas. It is a working process, as nothing is set in stone yet. I'm personally collaborating on 2 papers right now on the migration, Native American DNA migration, people in the Americas, and I know there are other scientists that are still working on that, and so we're not out of business with regard of reconstructing the histories of America. There is a lot that still need to be said, new evidence that is being discovered, and some evidence that perhaps will never be available or accessible.